There have been allegations of serious fundamental rights violations for years now.
Frontex registered the pushbacks in their own database as prevention of departure. But prevention of departure is just a cover-up term.
My most heartfelt advice for the new director of Frontex would be dismantle your agency.
Frontex as an agency was created in 2004, and since then there have been 3 reforms in 2012, 2016, and 2019. The third reform in 2019 massively increases the budget and the operational powers of Frontex. Frontex will now have up to 10,000 standing corps, will have executive powers very similar to the one of member states, including in the field of returns and voluntary returns, and will also have the possibility to acquire their own equipment, which will also include lethal weapons as well as surveillance drones and personal equipment. The expansion of Frontex powers in the field of returns is very problematic. In 2021, there have been the highest number of returns only in the first half of the year, and we have seen in parallel a decrease in the number of flights on which there was fundamental rights monitors, a decrease by 7%. Violation of fundamental rights by Frontex are not new. There have been allegations of serious fundamental rights violations for years now. For quite long, they have gone relatively unnoticed. But it's very concerning to see that there are reports, concrete reports of fundamental rights violations in all different areas of work that Frontex is involved in, including forced returns, voluntary returns, and control of borders, both at sea and at land. To give a couple of examples, at the border between Hungary and Serbia, there has been the use of batons, of tear gas, as well as deployment of dogs by Frontex. All of this has been revealed by Balkan Insight in 2020. And what is problematic is that despite the fact that violations at the Hungarian borders were quite known, and the Consultative Forum as well as the Fundamental Rights Officer had called on Frontex to withdraw from the area based on Article 46 of the regulation, Frontex refused to do so, and Frontex only withdrew from the area after a decision of the Court of Justice in 2021. Another example of Frontex fundamental rights violations concern the situation at sea. Evidence shows that Frontex were aware of pushbacks conducted by the Greek Coast Guard, and that despite it, not only they did not do anything to prevent them, but they also actively covered them up, including by lying to the European Parliament and by hiding the fact that EU budget was being used for these pushbacks.
Our investigations into pushbacks started in the Aegean when, after Turkey cancelled the deal with Europe to host refugees, they were putting pressure on the European Union and sending people towards the border who were then seeking or wanted to seek asylum. And Greece responded with the backup of the European Union to seal off its borders. And actually were not just closing its borders, but also sending actively people back. But not just sending it back, they use a lot of violence or putting people at risk by putting them on life rafts at the sea and leave them adrift without engine, and then informing most of the time Turkish Coast Guard for them to pick up. This is completely illegal because everybody has the right to claim asylum. After we proved that this happened, and this is still happening and still going on, we also thought, okay, Europe's border agency, Frontex, is heavily involved in the Aegean. It has multiple assets from most of the member states of the European Union active in the Aegean, in the region. And still they claimed not to know what was going on. So we started an investigation into what Frontex knew and if they were complicit or even actively involved in these illegal practices. In 2020 and 2021, we were able to prove that Frontex was not only seeing and were aware of the pushbacks, but they were actively involved in it. For example, one of the Romanian vessel active for Frontex operations in the Aegean were actively pushing boats, rubber boats, full with asylum seekers back to Turkey. Frontex denied this, despite that there was evidence, open source evidence, video evidence, maps and data evidence available. They continued to deny that this was going on and that they were even aware of it. During our investigations into Frontex, we also learned that all the operations that Frontex is involved in and all the incidents that they know about are registered in their own internal database called JORA. We did a FOIA request, so Freedom of Information request, and we obtained their full database, their JORA database. So all the incidents that were recorded across all their operations. This is a database of 1.2 million lines in an Excel sheet. So it's quite massive and it has hundreds of columns. Of course, they redacted most sensitive information, but still we were able to see certain things. And what also helped was that they forgot for a certain period, for a couple of months in the database, they forgot to redact the information. We were able, by looking at the database, to single out the incidents where we thought that was where Frontex was involved in pushbacks. We were able to see that Frontex was involved in not just one pushback that we already proved, but it were actually 22. And most likely it's much more because the database that they provided and the information that they provided is very much incomplete. The investigations done by us and our media partners contributed to the start of an investigation by OLAF. This is the independent anti-fraud organization from the European Union. They did an investigation into the pushbacks and the complicity of Frontex in these pushbacks. And the reports that came out showed that all our findings into the pushbacks were true. And Frontex knew at a very early stage that the Greek government was pushing back asylum seekers in the Aegean. They had video records of it, they had written record of it, there were communications between Frontex and the Greek government about it, and still they not only denied it publicly, but they also tried to cover this up. After our reporting and after the OLAF report, there was so much pressure on the management team of Frontex that the head of Frontex and his deputy had to resign.
L'externalisation, c'est quoi? C'est la sous-traitance du sale boulot que l'Union européenne ne veut pas faire, ou ne peut pas faire elle-même.
The EU is expanding its role in policing, both policing of its external borders through Frontex, but also supporting and enhancing police cooperation through the European policing agency, Europol. Both of these agencies' roles are becoming more prominent. Each raise many questions in terms of transparency, accountability, rule of law, and fundamental rights protection. We also need to scrutinize the cooperation between Frontex and Europol because it's becoming increasingly clear that these agencies are participating at EU level in promoting the same harmful narratives that we are seeing across member states in populist criminal policies to conflate migration issues with criminality. And that conflation has very real, concrete consequences. So last summer, a team of investigative journalists, for instance, reported that Frontex and Europol had sidelined their own data protection watchdogs in order to work together to set up a scheme for massive data collection of asylum seekers and migrants coming in to the EU, collecting very sensitive data. And that data collected by Frontex is feeding straight into Europol's already massive criminal databases. We need scrutiny over both agencies and their cooperation. So we're seeing that happening. We're seeing the European Parliament Civil Liberties Committee setting up a special hearing on this PEDRA surveillance scheme, especially as the agencies are just plowing ahead with this massive data collection and exchange system. Last spring, for instance, Europol and Frontex announced setting up a joint working group called the Future Group. This is a new surveillance program at the EU's external borders, once again, that would involve, it seems, from what we know, large-scale profiling of EU and other nationals using artificial intelligence. We also see just recently the European Parliament refusing to release Frontex budget on the basis of information that was finally disclosed from an investigation by the European Anti-Fraud Office into Frontex participation in the pushbacks of people left to die in the sea, and also into Frontex's own internal working environment with very serious concerns of sexual harassment in particular. We also need much more information from Europol about its activities, about what it's doing with all this information that it's gathering and collecting from Frontex in particular.
IT Flows, or It Flows, is a tool that is being developed by a consortium of private and public research institutions, as well as some charities, with funding from the European Union. And it is a tool that aims at forecasting, using an artificial intelligence, migration flows towards the European Union, as well as potential conflicts that could arise from migration flows with local populations. The project is receiving just under 5 million euros under the Secure Societies strand of the Horizon 2020 research program, which is the flagship research funding program of the European Union. So the data that is supposed to feed this artificial intelligence aimed at predicting migration flows is being collected mostly from open source data, such as the migration flows data that UN agencies such as IOM or UNHCR make available to the public. But most importantly, also with data that is being collected with interviews with migrants about their migration routes and why they chose to migrate in the first place. That is being collected with interviews with migrants hosted in facilities managed by some of the charities involved, such as Oxfam and the Red Cross. This is potentially problematic because, of course, the migrants interviewed for this project are in a vulnerable position. And although they are being made to sign an informed consent, it is not clear whether they could understand the full consequences of how the data extracted from their interviews is going to be used. And especially the fact that it could feed into restrictive migration policies that might ultimately harm people in their situation. So I think systems like IT Flows might have a potential harmful impact on migrants because it is very easy that the data that these applications produce are used to feed into the narrative that Europe is being invaded by migrants, and this could be used in turn to foster more restrictive migration policies. There is also the problem of what I would call technological reductionism, which is the idea that technological tools like artificial intelligence can effectively capture complex phenomena such as migration. which should be read on many different levels other than a mere number of migrants coming in from this spot or this other spot. So this is the main risk that I see for a system like this. And it's curious because most of the people behind it are people who are very well-intentioned. Again, these are people who are coming from research background or charity sector backgrounds who have a generally positive view of migration. But the problem is that such a vast amount of money is being spent by the European Union into projects that are by design aimed at reinforcing this idea that Europe is being flooded with migrants and we have to deal with this problem, that even the best intentioned projects could have harmful consequences. Frontex acts as a senior user on every H2020 Secure Society project. That means that every project that is funded by the European Union under the Secure Society strand has Frontex as an actor that selects whether the project should get the money or not, and also mentors this project throughout their development. This is, of course, problematic because we know what the track record of Frontex is when it comes to human rights and specifically the rights of migrants. And Frontex has made clear that they have an interest in developing a closer collaboration between IT flows and other projects that deal with border security and border forces abroad. So this is a concern because there is very little doubt about what Frontex would want to do with data regarding migration flows and border crossing into Europe. And what they would want to do is raising more border fences, making the crossing more difficult and more hazardous, which is what they've been doing in the past.
All of these examples point to a wider criminalization of migration in Europe by using an array of tools and practices to meet migrants, and particularly racialized migrants, with suspicion and punishment rather than support and care. These are, for instance, detaining people in camps upon arrival on European soil, charging them with criminal offenses for things like driving boats or helping fellow migrants along the journey. Even in a very shocking case, charging a person who attempted suicide with arson and destruction of property. We also see this commitment to punishment in how civil society and human rights defenders are treated. They're charged with things from espionage to organized crime. In some member states, organizations who help people with their asylum applications become liable in case these applications are denied by the state. This ultimately creates a chilling effect, dissuading people from assisting migrants. And this is unfortunately in line with the wider trend of over-reliance on criminalization at the EU level instead of investment in community-driven care. We must remember that what we treat as criminal is a political choice. And with the expansion of the security agenda treating Europe as a fortress, this political choice is increasingly racist. We're talking about a border-to-prison pipeline subjecting racialized migrants to surveillance, policing, incarceration on account of their migration status alone.
The mandate of Frontex is turning migration into a security problem. Migration is not a security issue by nature. It's not a security issue as such. It becomes so when a number of powerful actors with a lot of resources devote their resources to feed into this narrative.
Frontex is Europe's best funded agency, and that brings a lot of responsibility. From what we have seen in our investigations is that Frontex is trying to back up human rights violations in order to secure its missions. And changing the management team is not enough. There should also be a different direction of the agency where it's not about money and more budgets, but it's about securing Europe's borders, but also securing the human rights.
On the one hand, we need to ensure that there are efficient and effective accountability mechanisms within Frontex, that there is monitoring for all actions which can lead to fundamental rights violations, as well as a change in mentality within the agency and also a shift in the way that the budget is used. At the same time, we need to also change the way that migration policies are framed, because if we continue justifying returns at all costs, if we continue justifying racist policies, policies which legitimize pushbacks, policies which legitimize fundamental rights violations, then the risk is no matter who the new executive director will be, fundamental rights violations continue to occur at the EU borders and on the territory.
My most heartfelt advice for the new director of Frontex would be dismantle your agency, but trying to be more practical. Look, the former director Leggeri, after his dismissal, said that human rights activists wanted to turn Frontex into a fundamental rights agency. He said that ironically, but I actually don't think that would be much of a bad idea. Because look, national border forces do already a bad enough job at enforcing a deadly border regime on their own. Frontex, as a European Union agency, should make sure that national border forces in their day-to-day work upheld the fundamental rights that the EU claims to stand for.
The new director of Frontex cannot pretend they're unaware of these issues. At this point, there is no excuse for inaction. They must take responsibility for this. Policymakers are giving agencies like Frontex and Europol more and more power with very little oversight. We need to question the mandate we give these agencies and why, and make sure it's consistent with our expressed aspirations for a union of equality and diversity. Racial justice efforts are directly undercut by the criminalization of migration. What we're asking for is an acknowledgement of the harm done and a commitment to move in a different direction by reimagining the types of institutions we need.